He said I was useless after 70. He didn't even flinch when he said it, just kept scrolling on his phone, his thumbs dancing across the screen, while my heart cracked like old china. I stood by the kitchen counter, the afternoon light slanting through the window, catching the dust on the table I'd polished for 40 years. I had just asked him if he wanted tea, the same question I'd asked 1,000 times before. He didn't look up. "Mom," he said, with that tired tone people reserve for telemarketers and beggars, "you don't have to do all this anymore. You're 70. You should rest. You're basically retired from life." Retired from life. The words slid through me like a blade of ice. I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so cruelly absurd. I had raised that man from nothing. I scrubbed floors while my back screamed, stretched every coin into meals, and sat by his bedside through every fever and heartbreak. And now he said it as if I were a chair with a broken leg. He was sitting in the same kitchen where I had once taught him to hold a spoon, the same place where his tiny hands used to tug at my apron, asking for another cookie, the same room where he used to say, "When I grow up, I'll take care of you, Mom." I guess he kept that promise, just not the way I imagined. He thought I didn't notice when he sighed every time I asked a question. He thought I didn't hear him whisper to his wife, "She's just old. It's like living with a ghost." But ghosts hear everything, especially the ones still breathing. That night, when the house went quiet, I sat alone in my chair, the one by the window. Outside, the street light flickered, just like it used to when he was a boy afraid of the dark. I used to leave that light on for him. I didn't realize I'd need it one day to see through my own tears. I thought of all the years, 70 of them, each one carved with sacrifice and love. Every year was a chapter written in sweat. The year I worked double shifts, the year I went without new shoes, the year I buried his father but still cooked his favorite soup because he said it made him feel safe. And now I was useless? I picked up the family photo from the shelf. His graduation day. He was smiling, holding his degree, the one I helped pay for by selling my wedding bangles. I traced the edges of his face in the picture, wondering how that bright-eyed boy became a man who could look at his mother and see inconvenience instead of gratitude. You see, age doesn't hurt. Forgetting does. And I realized that night he had forgotten everything. But I hadn't. I remembered every scraped knee, every meal. Every night I stayed awake waiting for him to come home safe. I remembered the promises. And I remembered my worth. He thought 70 meant useless. I knew it meant unstoppable. Because once a woman survives everything life throws at her for 7 decades, she doesn't crumble, she plans. And that's exactly what I began to do. Not out of hate, but out of something stronger, justice. He needed to remember that love isn't disposable, that years have weight, that motherhood doesn't expire. So I decided I'd make him pay, not with anger, but with truth. For every year I raised him, for every meal I skipped so he could eat, for every tear I swallowed when life got cruel. He thought I was too old to make a difference. He was about to learn that a lifetime of silence can become thunder when you finally speak. That was the day something in me shifted, the day I stopped being his shadow and became his lesson. And if he thought I was useless after 70, he was about to find out just how powerful useless can be. I still remember the house we first lived in, the one with the cracked front step and the leaky roof that sang like a broken violin whenever it rained. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I used to say that love doesn't need marble floors. It only needs a place to echo. And in that little house it did. Laughter filled the kitchen, footsteps raced down the hall, and every night ended with my son asleep against my chest, his tiny hand clutching my finger like it was the whole world. Maybe for him it was. He was a miracle to me, born after 3 years of prayers and tears. I was 29 then, already a widow by heart if not by papers, because my husband worked in another city and only came home once every few months. But when that boy was born, I forgot loneliness. I forgot about exhaustion. I forgot everything but the weight of him in my arms and the promise I made quietly to the ceiling fan spinning above us that I would give him everything I never had. Morning light in those years was my favorite thing. It always started with the sound of the kettle whistling and the soft thud of his feet running into the kitchen. He'd climb up on the little stool, still half asleep, and say, "Toast, Mama?" His hair stuck up like dry grass, and he always smelled faintly of soap and sleep. I'd butter the bread, hand it to him, and watch as he devoured it like it was the greatest feast in the world. One day, I'd tell him, "You'll have toast in a big house with big windows and servants to butter it for you." He'd grin through a mouthful of crumbs and say, "Only if you're there too, Mama." Those words used to be my heartbeat. We didn't have much, but we built a kingdom out of simple things. Second-hand clothes washed till they shone, borrowed books read under candlelight, and laughter that didn't cost a thing. Every evening, I'd wait for him at the school gate, standing in the sun with a folded umbrella. He'd come running, school bag bouncing, his face bright with stories. Sometimes he'd stop mid-run, pretending to faint dramatically so I'd have to scoop him up and carry him. Other mothers would laugh, saying, "You'll spoil him, Amina." I'd just smile. They didn't know how hard I'd prayed for something to spoil. He was my reason to keep breathing through every hardship. When his father passed away suddenly, it was the boy's small voice that kept me from collapsing. "Don't cry, Mama," he said, patting my cheek like he'd seen adults do. "I'll take care of you." He was 7, and already carrying the weight of a promise he couldn't yet understand. I took jobs no one wanted, cleaning houses, sewing clothes, washing floors, anything that kept him fed and in school. I remember coming home late one night, my hands raw from detergent, and finding him asleep at the table with a book still open. The candle had burned down to a stub. Next to his notebook was a plate of cold food he'd saved for me. He must have waited, fighting sleep, because he always insisted we eat together. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "You're my everything, my boy." He stirred but didn't wake, and I just stood there, staring at him, wondering what kind of man he'd become. When he turned 13, I bought him his first wristwatch. It wasn't fancy, just a small silver thing from the market, but he wore it like gold. "Now you can tell time properly," I'd said, teasing. He looked up at me and said, "So I'll never be late to help you." And he meant it then. I saw it in his eyes, that childlike, unshaken loyalty. He grew fast, too fast. The boy who used to chase pigeons in the yard became a teenager who spent evenings in his room studying or listening to music. I tried not to hover, though I'd sometimes linger by his door just to hear the faint hum of his laughter or the rustle of papers. When he left for college, the house felt like a ghost town. His bed stayed made, his shoes untouched by the door. I'd walk past his room every morning just to straighten his sheets, pretending he'd just stepped out for a moment. When he came home on holidays, he'd bring gifts, scarves, tea tins, sometimes a new radio. "You don't have to buy me things," I'd tell him. "Just sit with me." And he would, for a while. We'd drink tea, talk about his studies, his friends, his dreams. He spoke with such excitement that I could almost see the man he was becoming. "One day," he said once, "I'll buy you a big house with white curtains. You'll never have to lift a finger again." I laughed and said, "I'll hold you to that." And he did keep that promise, in his own way. When he finally did buy that house, years later, I moved in. White curtains, yes. A big kitchen, yes. But something was missing. Something invisible, like warmth. The house was quiet, too clean, too careful. It wasn't filled with our old laughter. It was filled with walls that listened to everything and said nothing back. His wife was polite, but distant. I never blamed her. She was young, modern, the kind who measured love in efficiency. Still, I tried to fit in. I cooked, I tended the garden, I folded clothes. Even though she had machines to do all that, it made me feel needed, useful. Sometimes I'd hum old songs while watering the plants, and she'd smile faintly but never join in. I began to feel like a painting hung in the wrong room, looked at but never really seen. My son changed in small ways first. A shorter hug, a distracted nod, a glance at his phone when I spoke. He'd tell me to rest when I reached for the dishes, to relax when I offered to cook. "You've done enough, Mom," he'd say. I thought it was love, until I realized it was distance. The turning point came quietly, like a slow fog. One evening, I made his favorite dish, lamb stew, simmered for hours the way he liked it. When he came home, I was waiting with the pot on the table, the aroma filling the room. He walked in, sniffed the air, and said, "Oh, you cooked?" But his voice was flat, as though it were an inconvenience. His wife frowned and whispered, "We already ate out." They passed the table like it wasn't there. I sat alone with the stew, its warmth fading into the air. That night I sat on the porch and looked at the stars. I wondered if I had done something wrong, if maybe love has an expiration date. But then I remembered his childhood laughter, his little arms around my neck, the way he used to say, "You're my home, Mama." I realized then that I wasn't wrong. I was just forgotten. And forgetting hurts more than hate ever could. Those years, the ones I built with my bare hands, with my sweat, with my love, they had turned into ghosts that followed me through that big, beautiful, silent house. Every corner held a memory. Every wall whispered a story he no longer wanted to hear. But even ghosts remember, and one day they wake up. It began with small things, barely noticeable, like a draft slipping through a closed window. The kind of things you tell yourself don't matter. A forgotten thank you, a sigh when I repeated myself, a phone left unanswered. But little things build mountains, and before you know it, you're standing at the bottom, looking up at someone you once carried on your shoulders, wondering when he started looking down on you. I had learned to live quietly in that house. I woke early, made my tea, watered the plants, and sat by the window watching the neighborhood awake. Sometimes I'd hear laughter from my son's room, a conversation between him and his wife, or maybe his colleagues. Their voices were full of youth, plans, and motion. Mine was full of memories. I stayed out of their way mostly, not out of fear, but out of courtesy. I didn't want to be that kind of mother, the one who interfered. But distance, I learned, doesn't protect you from being a burden. It only makes it easier for them to forget you're there. One evening, I overheard them in the living room. I hadn't meant to listen, but when your world shrinks to four walls, voices are the only visitors you get. His wife was saying, "Your mother's slowing down. Maybe it's time to think about what's next. Her tone wasn't cruel, just practical, the way you talk about rearranging furniture. He sighed, the way he always did before saying something that would sting. I know. She doesn't even realize how old she is now. She keeps trying to help, but it just creates more work for us. There was silence, then her soft laugh. She's sweet, though. He replied, Yeah, but we can't have her living like this forever. She'll fall one day or forget the stove on. Maybe we should sell the old place, get her a smaller one near the senior center. I stood frozen in the hallway, one hand on the doorframe. The old place, my home, the one where I had raised him, where his father's picture still hung, was just a line in a casual conversation. A property, not a memory. He talked about me like I was an obligation being passed along. Not Mom, not the woman who gave up everything. Just a problem to solve before it becomes inconvenient. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and tried to steady my breathing. The air felt thick, heavy, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. I looked around, the neatly folded quilt, the photographs, the vase of artificial flowers I kept on the dresser. Everything in that room was an archive of love, and yet none of it seemed to hold weight anymore. To them, I had become background noise. The next morning I made breakfast, paratas, his favorite. When I called him to eat, he came down in a rush, half-dressed, looking at his phone. Mom, I told you, we're eating out today, remember? I blinked. Oh, I must have forgotten. He smiled faintly, not kind, not cruel, just detached. You really should rest more. You're not young anymore. Let me handle things, okay? He didn't notice that the teacup in my hand trembled. He didn't see the paratas cooling on the table untouched. He kissed my forehead, a quick, perfunctory gesture, and left. The door closed with a sound that echoed through me like a verdict. A week later, the real blow came. He called me into the living room one Sunday afternoon. His wife was sitting on the couch, tablet in hand, scrolling through something that looked too official to be casual. The sunlight from the window cast long bars across the floor, and I could see the dust floating in it, glittering like forgotten promises. Mom, he began, we've been thinking about what's best for you. My stomach tightened. Best for me? He nodded, his voice calm, too calm. You're 70 now. You've worked hard your whole life. You deserve comfort, safety, routine. We found a really good place. It's not far, has gardens, other seniors, activities. I didn't let him finish. A home, I said quietly. You mean a home for old people? He flinched, then smiled as if he could soften it with words. It's not like that. It's independent living. You'll have your own space, your own friends. We'll visit all the time. I stared at him. You mean you'll visit when you have time? His wife shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. It's just that the house is too big and you're here alone most days. You could have a social life there, people your age. People my age. I looked at them both, so polished, so certain of their kindness. I wondered if they could hear the sound of my heart splintering beneath their gentle logic. I have a life here, I said softly. My friends, my plants, my kitchen, my memories. I'm not furniture you can relocate. He sighed, that same sigh that meant he was done pretending to understand. Mom, please, don't make this hard. You don't realize how much you need this. You'll thank us later. The room went silent. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but the cold awareness that I was being erased while still alive. He reached out, touching my hand. You've done enough, Mom. Let us take care of you now. I looked at his hand, those same fingers I once cleaned after every meal, the ones that once reached for me in fear. Now they were steady, firm, deciding my fate. Take care of me, I whispered, or take me out of your way. His wife opened her mouth to protest, but I stood up before she could. My chair scraped against the floor, loud and sharp. When your father died, I didn't ask anyone to take care of me. I worked, I survived, I raised you. I didn't need a home then, and I don't need one now. He looked up, exasperated. You're being emotional. This is for your own good. That sentence, for your own good, has been used to justify so many cruelties in this world. Something inside me broke quietly, like glass under a heavy shoe. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just looked at him, really looked at him. The man standing before me was not my little boy anymore. He was a stranger wearing my son's face, armed with pity and practicality instead of love. I see, I said. You've already made up your mind. He hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. It's what's best. I nodded slowly. Then I suppose I should start packing. He blinked, surprised. Mom, we don't have to rush. No, I interrupted, my voice firm. I wouldn't want to inconvenience you. I walked past him, every step heavy with 70 years of sacrifice. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I could feel their eyes on my back. Her relief, his guilt, both wrapped in silence. I didn't turn around. I didn't want them to see my tears. Upstairs, I closed my door and leaned against it. The sound of my heartbeat filled the quiet. The walls seemed to close in, whispering everything I already knew, that love, once taken for granted, becomes invisible. I sank to the bed and stared at the packed suitcases in my imagination. For the first time, I wondered what it must feel like to be truly homeless, not because you lack a roof, but because you no longer have a place in someone's heart. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, tracing the cracks on the ceiling, remembering his laughter as a child, the way he used to grip my hand at the market, the way he once called me his hero. I wondered when I stopped being a hero and became a burden. I wondered if he even realized that every comfort he had, every step of his success, was built on the bones of my exhaustion. By morning, my decision was made. I would not beg for space in a house I helped build. I would not live in a room paid for with the coins of pity. If he thought 70 was useless, I would show him the kind of strength that only 70 years can teach. The quiet, patient kind that doesn't scream, but acts. The betrayal was complete that day. Not because he tried to send me away, but because he believed he was right to do it. Because he thought love meant deciding for me, not standing beside me. Because he forgot that even old roots can crack the ground if they're buried deep enough. When he left for work that morning, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the street. The sunlight fell over the empty chair beside mine. I whispered to no one in particular, "He thinks I'm useless now, but he's about to learn what 70 years of love and pain can really do." The house felt different after that day. Quieter, heavier, like it had inhaled my sorrow and refused to exhale. Each room carried the ghost of something I had once loved. Laughter, tiny footsteps, the smell of fresh laundry and lentil soup simmering on the stove. Now even the walls seemed to turn their faces away from me. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. Not anger, not quite sadness, but a dull, continuous ache, like the sound of a clock ticking in an empty room. Time was moving, but I wasn't. Mornings used to be filled with purpose. I would rise early, feed the birds, hum softly to myself while sweeping the courtyard. Now I sat by the window long after the sun had climbed high, clutching a cup of tea gone cold. I watched neighbors walk their dogs, school children rush past, women hanging clothes to dry. The rhythm of ordinary life continuing as if my heart hadn't cracked open quietly behind glass. The teacup trembled once in my hand, and I realized my fingers were shaking, not from age, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. At night, I found myself listening for his footsteps, the way I once did when he was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. Back then, that sound meant relief. He was home, safe, mine. Now, even when he walked through the door, I felt no comfort. He moved around me like a stranger, renting space. His voice was polite, distant. Every "How are you, Mom?" rehearsed and brief, like an actor reading lines in a play he no longer cared to finish. I began to doubt myself. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was getting old. Maybe my worth had expired somewhere between his childhood and his success. Once I had been everything, the voice that soothed his fears, the hands that healed every scraped knee, the arms that lifted him above every disappointment. I remembered the smell of soap on his school uniform as I ironed it every morning, the way he used to run into my arms after football practice, sweaty and laughing, shouting, "I scored, Mom!" My chest would swell with pride. I never thought that one day, those same arms would fold defensively across his chest while telling me where I belonged. Every day felt like walking through a museum of my own life, relics of devotion frozen in time. The framed photo on the shelf of his graduation day, where I had cried so hard I ruined my lipstick. The recipe book was stained with oil and turmeric, where every page was a story of love disguised as food. The clock he bought me for Mother's Day years ago, now ticking too loudly in the silence. Even my reflection in the mirror began to change. My eyes looked softer, tired, not from sleepless nights, but from seeing too much. My hair, once silver with pride, now looked like surrender. I tried to busy myself. I cleaned drawers that didn't need cleaning, folded sheets that were already folded. I rearranged my small collection of teacups, one for every year he'd left for college and came back with less of himself. I told myself this was just a phase, that love doesn't disappear, it just gets tired sometimes. But deep down, I knew. Love, when taken for granted, doesn't tire, it fades, quietly, like sunlight in an empty hallway.
One afternoon, I found his old report cards while sorting through boxes in the attic. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but my handwriting in the parent's signature box was still clear, firm, proud. I traced the letters with my finger and smiled bitterly. I remembered the nights I stayed up helping him study, how I'd pretend to understand algebra just to make him believe he wasn't alone. I remembered saving coins in a jar so he could go on his school trip, the way his eyes lit up when I handed him the envelope. I had built his wings out of my own bones, and now that he could fly, he had forgotten who gave him the sky. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the remnants of a life spent giving, and felt a wave of something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Despair. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and paralyzing. It crawled up my throat and settled like a stone in my chest. I wept then, not just for him, but for every version of myself I had left behind. The young woman who dreamed of a family, the mother who believed her sacrifices meant something, the widow who thought raising a good son would be her redemption. My tears fell onto the papers, blurring the ink, as if even the past didn't want to be remembered clearly anymore. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I stopped opening the curtains. Light made the emptiness too visible. I ate less, spoke less, existed quietly like a shadow that had outlived its body. My neighbors stopped by once or twice asking if I was all right. I smiled and said yes, because I didn't know how to explain that being alive and being all right were two entirely different things. Sometimes I'd sit outside at dusk and watch the streetlights flicker on. I used to love that moment when day and night touched hands, trading places gently. Now it reminded me of something harsher, the way people trade love for convenience, the way youth trades gratitude for pride. I thought of the nights I'd stay up waiting for him to come home from work, the food kept warm in the oven. He never asked me to, but I did it anyway, because that's what mothers do. They wait and wait. And sometimes they wait so long that love starts to rot in the silence. I began to talk to myself, softly, like an old habit I couldn't break. "You did your best," I would whisper while folding his laundry. "You gave him everything." But the walls didn't answer, and neither did the photographs. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the window at night and not recognize the woman staring back. She looked hollow, transparent, like someone waiting to be remembered. Once I held his hand crossing the street. Now he acts like I'm in his way. That thought haunted me. I replayed it over and over like a line from a song I couldn't forget. When did the roles reverse? When did care become an inconvenience? When did my love become something
He wanted to manage, not cherish. The questions had no answers, and yet they echoed endlessly in the corridors of my mind. On his next visit, he brought me brochures, glossy pages, filled with smiling elderly people, painting, gardening, laughing under bright skies. "Look, Mom," he said gently, "doesn't this look nice? You'd have people your age, friends, activities." His voice blurred as I stared at the photographs. None of those faces looked real. They looked like masks, painted happiness hiding quiet despair. "It's beautiful," I said softly, "but I'm not ready." He sighed, setting the brochure down. "You keep saying that, but you'll have to be, soon." The word "have" stung more than I let him see. After he left, I sat there for hours, staring at those pictures until the faces seemed to fade, replaced by memories of my own youth, the laughter, the dreams, the hands that once held my baby close. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams of my younger self, standing in the same house, walls glowing with warmth, the air alive with my son's laughter. Then the light dimmed, and I saw myself sitting alone, older, watching shadows move where joy once lived. I woke up with tears wetting my pillow, whispering, "You can't erase me. You can't." It was the first spark of something new, small, faint, but alive. In the days that followed, I found myself looking at things differently. The pain was still there, but beneath it, something was hardening, not bitterness, but resolve. I still cooked his favorite dishes, not because he asked, but because they reminded me that love once existed here. I still tended my garden, trimming dead leaves, planting new ones. There was comfort in that, in knowing that even decay had its purpose. Flowers bloom from soil fed by what once lived. Maybe my grief would bloom into something too. Something he wouldn't expect. The silence that once felt suffocating began to sound different, not empty, but full of waiting. I was descending, yes, into sorrow, into memory, into myself, but there was something sacred in that descent, like going down to the bottom of a well to find the reflection of the sky. I realized then that losing faith in someone doesn't mean losing yourself. He might have forgotten who I was, but I hadn't. I was still the woman who could rebuild from ashes. I was still the mother who had turned scarcity into abundance, loneliness into love.
They could take my home, my comfort, my place at the table, but they couldn't take my strength. I began writing again. Small notes at first, tucked into my diary, words I'd never said aloud. You will remember me one day, not because I stayed silent, but because I learned to rise quietly. Each sentence was a thread, weaving me back into myself. The grief no longer felt endless. It was becoming a shape, one I could walk around, understand, and eventually step beyond. My silence wasn't surrender anymore. It was strategy. And though no one could see it, something inside me had begun to awaken. Slow, steady, unstoppable. It was calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that only comes when a woman has finally decided enough. The turning point didn't arrive like thunder. It came quietly, like a breath returning after too long underwater. It was a Sunday morning, calm, sunlit, deceptively ordinary. I was sitting in the living room, mending a tear in my shawl, the one he had bought me years ago when his first salary came. The fabric had grown thin with time, just like the bond between us. Still, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was soft, comforting, a memory I could wrap around myself when the house felt too big, too silent. He and his wife were in the kitchen, speaking softly at first, their voices threading through the thin walls. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The words simply found me. "She can't keep living like this," his wife said. "The house is too much for her." He sighed. "I know, but she won't listen. She still thinks she's in control. She doesn't realize she's past her time." Past her time. The phrase landed with the same chill as useless. I felt my hand still on the fabric, the needle suspended midair. Past her time? As if I were a wilted flower waiting to be swept away. They spoke about me as though I were a piece of furniture no longer matching the decor. "We could sell the house," she continued, "use the money for something practical, maybe expand the business or a new car." There was a pause, then his voice, "Yeah, I'll talk to her again. Maybe if I tell her it's for her own good, she'll agree." For her own good. Those words cut deeper than honesty ever could. I sat there in the chair that once rocked him to sleep and felt something stir deep inside me, something ancient, steady, and alive. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was realization, the quiet kind that doesn't explode but transforms. I looked down at the shawl in my lap, at the tiny stitches I had been making. Each thread, carefully pulled through the cloth, strong enough to hold it together despite its age. I smiled faintly. Maybe I was like that shawl. Old, yes, but held together by years of love and labor. Not fragile, just seasoned. I finished mending the tear, folded the shawl neatly, and stood up. My knees ached slightly, a reminder that time had indeed left its fingerprints on me. But I walked with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. I went to my room and opened the old chest by my bed. Inside were the remnants of a life lived quietly but fully. Letters from my late husband, my son's childhood drawings, faded receipts from the years I struggled to make ends meet. I picked up one of those drawings, a stick-figure boy holding hands with a taller figure labeled Mom. Above it, in shaky handwriting, he had written, "My hero." That word, hero. It echoed through me, awakening something I had almost forgotten. I sat there for a long time, tracing the uneven lines with trembling fingers. That little boy had once looked up to me as the center of his world. I had been his comfort, his strength, his reason to believe that the world was kind. Somewhere along the way, the man he became forgot that truth, but I hadn't. I looked at that paper and whispered, "You made me your hero once. I'll remind you who I am."
That afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, touching each object as though saying goodbye, not in sadness, but in reverence. Every corner told a story of endurance. The kitchen window where I used to watch him run to the school bus, waving until he disappeared. The dining table where I taught him to pray before meals. The cupboard where I hid small gifts for his birthdays. I realized then that this house wasn't a burden. It was my autobiography carved in walls and wood. Selling it would be like erasing my name from the pages of my own life. I brewed myself a cup of tea, strong and dark, and sat by the window. The sunlight hit the rim of the cup, making it glow amber. I remembered how he used to call it magic tea when he was little, said it made the world look golden. I smiled at the memory, but this time it didn't hurt. It healed, because I finally understood love doesn't vanish. It just changes form. It grows quieter, wiser, and sharper with time. As I sipped, I made a decision, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I would not beg to stay in my own home. I would not defend my right to exist. Instead, I would act with the same grace I had taught him all his life. But this time, I would teach through consequence, not comfort. That night, I opened my diary and began writing again, not to vent, but to plan. I listed every asset I had, the house, the savings account, the pension, even the jewelry tucked away in a velvet pouch. I thought of every year I had spent holding his life together and how easily he now wanted to dismantle mine. For my own good, he had said. I smiled at that phrase as I wrote it down. Yes, I thought, maybe I'll finally do something for my own good, but on my terms. Over the next few days, I started making quiet moves. I called my lawyer, an old friend from my late husband's days, and asked for a visit. I didn't tell my son. The lawyer came on a Thursday afternoon, and we sat at the same dining table where I had once served my son his favorite biryani. I explained my situation calmly, and he listened, his eyes softening with understanding. "You're a wise woman," he said finally. "Most people your age would surrender, but you're protecting what you built. That's not defiance. That's dignity." When he left, I felt lighter, not because I had a plan, but because I had reclaimed my voice. A few days later, my son visited again. He found me in the garden, trimming the roses. He looked surprised to see me humming softly. "You seem happy," he said cautiously. "I am," I replied, not looking up. "I decided to take your advice." His eyes lit up. "You did? About the house?" I smiled faintly. "Yes, about my life. You're right. I should do what's best for me." He relaxed, relief washing over his face. "That's good, Mom. I knew you'd see the reason." I nodded, clipping another rose, letting the petals fall at my feet. "Yes," I said quietly, "reason and truth, both are overdue." He didn't understand what I meant, not yet, but I did. That night, I took out an envelope and placed inside it a letter, one I'd written to him but never sent. It began with "My dearest son," and ended with "I forgive you, but I will also remind you who I am." I sealed it and placed it in my drawer. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It was a mirror, waiting for the right moment to be held up. In the days that followed, I noticed a shift in myself. The grief that had clung to me like fog began to lift. I started cooking again, not for him, but for myself. I played old songs on the radio, sang along, even danced a little while sweeping the floor. The neighbors noticed. "You look different," one of them said. I smiled.
Maybe I finally remembered who I am. Each act of self-care became an act of quiet rebellion. Every meal I cooked, every flower I planted, every smile I allowed myself, it all built towards something larger. I wasn't preparing for revenge in the way most imagine it. I was preparing for revelation. I wanted him to see, not through my words, but through my choices, that I was still the same woman who built him from love and strengths. One morning, I went to the attic again, where dust motes floated like slow snow in the sunlight. I found my late husband's old journal and flipped through it until I reached the page where he had written, "If life ever tries to make you small, stand taller in your silence." I pressed my palm against the page and felt a surge of calm. That was the moment I knew exactly what I needed to do next. It wasn't about fighting my son. It was about reclaiming the story, the same story he thought was ending. So I began writing everything. My memories, my struggles, the sacrifices I had made. I turned pain into paragraphs, silence into sentences. Each night I wrote until the ink ran low and my fingers cramped. I poured my entire life onto those pages.
Not out of bitterness, but legacy. I wanted my truth preserved, not for him, but for myself, and maybe one day for his children to read. By the time I finished, dawn was creeping through the curtains. The world outside was quiet, but inside, I felt a steady heartbeat of power. Calm, sacred, unstoppable. I realized that power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with anger or revenge. It grows slowly, like dawn, spreading light 1 inch at a time until darkness has nowhere left to hide. That was my turning point. Not a scream, not a fight, just a realization. I had nothing left to prove, and everything left to claim. I wasn't the woman waiting for permission anymore. I was the woman preparing to teach one last, unforgettable lesson. And when the time came, he would finally understand. The hands that once fed you can also be the ones that make you remember what love really costs. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that pretends to be ordinary, only to turn into a quiet storm. The morning sunlight spilled across my kitchen table, illuminating the worn wood where decades of breakfast, laughter, and tears had taken place. I sat there with a cup of tea and the letter I had written weeks ago, the one that began with, "My dearest son." The ink had faded slightly at the edges where my fingers had touched it too many times. Today, it will finally find its purpose. The lawyer had called earlier that morning to confirm the transfer was complete. My house, my savings, and the small pension that I had guarded for years were no longer tethered to my son's expectations. Every coin, every ounce of sweat-earned security had been redirected, not toward his comfort, but toward meaning, toward those who, like me, had been called past their time. I had donated nearly everything to a charity that built homes and skills programs for elderly women abandoned by their families. The organization would use my house as their new community center, a place where women could live, teach, and reclaim their dignity. I asked them to name it the Golden Years Home, in loving honor of all the mothers who were told they were useless. It wasn't revenge. It was a restoration. When my son arrived that evening, I was sitting in the garden, surrounded by the blooming roses I had tended for decades. He looked hurried, as always, tapping his phone before even greeting me. "Mom, we need to talk about the sale. I spoke to a realtor." I raised a hand gently, stopping him. "There's no need, dear," I said softly. "The house has already been sold." He blinked, stunned, What? You, what do you mean you sold it? I nodded, sipping my tea. It's done. The papers were signed yesterday. His voice rose, a mix of confusion and panic. To whom? Mom, we could have gotten a great deal. You didn't even... I didn't sell it for profit, I interrupted, still calm. I gave it away. To women like me. Women who raised children who forgot them. His mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, he looked like the boy who once struggled to form words in front of his teacher. You gave it away? He whispered, disbelief flickering into anger. Mom, that's insane. This was your home, our home. I smiled sadly. Was it? You wanted it gone. You said it was too much for me. You were right. It was too much. Too full of memories that no longer belonged to me. He stepped forward, his voice trembling. But what about your savings? How will you live? I set my teacup down and met his eyes. I'll live just fine. I've arranged everything. The charity provides housing and a stipend. They even asked if I'd like to mentor some of the women, teach them what I know about budgeting, cooking, and running a home with dignity. Imagine that. At 70, I have a new job. He looked lost, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. You can't just give everything away. What about me? What about... I tilted my head, studying him. What about you? He swallowed hard, his face tightening. I mean, you didn't even tell me. I let out a soft sigh. For years, I told you everything. When I was happy, when I was tired, when I needed help. You stopped listening long ago. I suppose I just adapted. He stood there in silence, the air between us heavy with everything we had left unsaid. I reached into my pocket and handed him the envelope, the letter I had written long ago. You'll find your answers here, I said. Read it when you're alone. He hesitated before taking it. His fingers brushed mine briefly, a touch that felt like a ghost of what once was. Then he turned and walked inside. That night, after he left, I sat on the porch and watched the sky darken. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt vast, like I had finally expanded back into my own skin. The breeze smelled of rain and roses, the world humming softly around me. There was peace in knowing that my love, redirected, would now become a shelter for others. Later, my son called. His voice on the phone was strained, shaky. Mom? He said, I read your letter. I said nothing, waiting. His voice cracked as he continued. Why didn't you tell me you were hurting like that? Would you have listened? I asked gently. There was a long silence. Then, quietly, I don't know. I closed my eyes. Then, maybe it's better this way. Sometimes understanding comes only after loss. In that letter, I had told him everything. Not with bitterness, but with truth. I wrote about the nights I'd stayed up waiting for him to come home, the meals I'd kept warm, the dreams I'd put aside. I told him about the silence that grew between us, how it suffocated more than loneliness ever could. I reminded him of the promises he once made, to care, to respect, to remember. And finally, I told him why I gave everything away. Because love, my son, is not about ownership. It's about legacy. And my legacy is not a house filled with furniture. It's a home filled with purpose. I gave away the walls that trapped me so that others could find freedom within them. I wanted to remind you that money fades, but what we build from kindness outlives us. At the bottom of the page, I had written one final line. You called me useless. This is a useless building. He didn't speak for a long time. Then I heard him crying softly. Not the kind of cry that demands comfort, but the kind that comes from finally seeing the truth. I'm sorry, Mom. I forgot who you were. He whispered. I smiled, tears rolling down my cheeks. Now you remember, I said quietly. That's enough. After the call ended, I sat by the window and looked at the stars. Each one shimmered like a memory, some distant, some close, all part of the same story. The house around me was no longer mine, but the peace in my heart was. Weeks later, I moved into the new community home. It was smaller, simpler, but alive with laughter. Women my age gathered in the evenings to cook, paint, and tell stories. They called me Ma, and I found joy in their company, in teaching them how to stretch a meal, how to mend old clothes, how to hold their heads high again. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants outside, a black car pulled up. My son stepped out, holding a box of supplies. "For the center," he said softly. "The charity told me you could use these." I smiled. "That's kind of you." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed me something. My old photograph, the one from his graduation day. "I thought you might want this back," he said. I looked at it, then back at him. "Keep it," I said. "It's a reminder of where we began." He nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, he looked at me, really looked at me, not as a burden, but as a person, a mother, a woman who had given him life and just taught him a lesson he would never forget. When he left, I stood in the doorway watching the car disappear down the road. I didn't feel triumphant or victorious. I felt free. Inside, the other women were singing an old song from my youth, their voices blending like sunlight and memory. I joined them, my heart light. Poetic justice doesn't need applause. It only needs truth. And as I stood there, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and life, I whispered to myself, "He said I was useless after 70, so I built something eternal from the very hands he thought had nothing left to give." Grace had done what anger never could. And that, I realized, was the most powerful kind of revenge, the kind that heals, even as it humbles. The days that followed moved slowly, like the turning pages of an old diary. The air at the new community home was softer somehow, filled with laughter, clinking teacups, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the shared kitchen. Each morning, I woke not to the silence of an empty house, but to the hum of voices. Women who carried stories like mine, bruised yet unbroken. There was no bitterness left in me, only an understanding that pain, when tended with patience, blooms into peace. I spent my mornings watering the roses in the courtyard, roses I had planted myself, their roots finding new soil just as I had. Children from the nearby school often visited to paint or redo us, their giggles echoing down the halls. Life had circled back, not to where it began, but to where it could finally rest. In the evenings, we would gather in the common room. Some of the women sewed quilts. Others wrote letters to children who no longer answered. I taught a few how to balance a budget, how to stretch a pension, how to keep dignity even in scarcity. I would tell them we may not have much, but what we do have, our wisdom, our patience, our stories, cannot be bought or stolen. They would nod, their faces soft with understanding. It was during one of these evenings that the doorbell rang. I looked up from my chair to see a familiar figure in the doorway. My son. His presence was tentative, his eyes downcast, as though he were entering sacred ground. He carried a small basket of groceries and a bouquet of white lilies. The room went quiet, the air holding its breath. "Mom," he said softly. I smiled, setting aside my knitting. "You found me." He nodded. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm doing quite well," I said gently. "Better than I have in a long time." He looked around, his gaze resting on the women chatting nearby. This place, It's beautiful. I didn't realize. He stopped himself, swallowing. I didn't realize what you meant when you said you gave the house away for something greater. I gestured for him to sit beside me. Sometimes you have to lose a house to find a home, I said. He lowered his eyes. I read your letter every night, he admitted. It's like hearing your voice again. I wish I had listened sooner. I placed my hand over his, the same hand that once held his through every fever, every heartbreak. We all listen when we're ready, I said softly, and I think, finally, you are. Tears welled in his eyes. You shouldn't have had to teach me this way. I shook my head. I didn't do it to teach you. I did it to free myself. The lesson was just a gift that came after. He looked around again, at the women, at the flowers, at the sunlight streaming through the windows. You've made something incredible here, he said quietly. You've turned pain into purpose. I smiled. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We take scraps and make something beautiful. He reached into his pocket and handed me an envelope. I made a donation to the home. I want to help. I want to be part of this. My heart swelled, but I didn't cry. Not anymore. I had already shed the tears that needed shedding. Now I only had room for gratitude. That's kind, I said, but don't do it for me. Do it for the women who still need to believe they matter. He nodded, wiping his eyes. I will. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset stain the sky in gold and rose. It felt like forgiveness, not the loud kind that demands words, but the quiet kind that settles deep in the soul. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. Mom, he said, can I visit again? I smiled. You don't need to ask. After he left, one of the women, Clara, a retired nurse with silver hair and a laugh like wind chimes, came to sit beside me. That's your boy? She asked with a grin. Yes, I said, that's my boy. She nodded approvingly. Looks like he's learning. Slowly, I said, but learning, yes. That night, as I sat in my small room, I looked around at the photos I'd hung on the wall, not of the past, but of the present. Women planting gardens, children smiling, meals shared, laughter frozen in time. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the one I had earned. I opened my journal, the one I kept since moving here, and began to write. Once I thought my story ended when my son stopped calling me Mom, but I was wrong. That was only the intermission. The real story began when I stopped waiting to be remembered and started remembering myself. The pen moved easily, words flowing like a river long blocked, finally set free. They say revenge brings satisfaction. I think they're wrong. It's peace that brings real satisfaction. Peace that doesn't shout, doesn't flaunt, but simply breathes. I closed the journal, feeling the warmth of those words settle into me. I walked to the window and opened it, letting the night breeze in. The moon hung full and luminous, its light spilling across the garden below. The roses were blooming, wild, fearless, unrestrained. In that moment, I understood something profound. The world had not taken anything from me that I could not rebuild. I had thought age made me invisible, but it turned out age made me infinite. The next morning, the newspaper arrived with a small feature on our home. Local Women's Center transforms lives through acts of grace. Beneath the headline was a photo of us standing together, holding hands. The article called me the heart behind the home. I laughed softly to myself, a quiet, knowing laugh. If only they knew how that heart had been broken before it learned to beat again. Weeks passed, and my son became a regular visitor. Sometimes he brought his children, my grandchildren, Shy at first, then curious, then joyous. They helped plant new flowers, painted signs, and joined our weekly storytelling evenings. I could see it in their eyes, the beginning of a different legacy. One day, as we were all sitting under the shade of the old mango tree, my grandson looked at me and said, "Grandma, did you really give away your house?" I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I did." "Why?" he asked, his little brow furrowed. I smiled and touched his cheek. "Because sometimes the things we give away grow into something far more beautiful than the things we keep." He pondered that for a moment, then grinned. "That's kinda cool." "Yes," I said, "it is." As laughter filled the garden once more, I felt the final weight of the past lift from my shoulders. There was no more proving to do, no more wounds to revisit. My son had learned, my heart had healed, and my life, once dimmed, now glowed softly, steadily, like candlelight that refuses to die. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I stood alone in the garden and whispered to the air, "He forgot who made him." I reminded him without saying a word. The wind carried my words gently through the roses. Age has not made me useless. It has made me timeless. And that, I realized, was the final truth of it all, the kind that lingers long after the story ends, the kind that makes the audience close their eyes and smile through their tears. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's peaceful.